Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Hi. Hello, friends, fellow Buddhists, curious seekers of truth. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting the channel. I'll remind you to like and subscribe to this channel just to keep the vitality and the searchability of our resources here for those who are curious about practicing Buddhism, Nichiren's doctrine of Shakyamuni's teachings of the Lotus Sutra. We've been reading about the life of Nichiren from an over 100-year-old, 110, 112, well, it's an older scholarship of modern day on Nichiren's life. And there's a lot of sources for Nichiren's life. They come through sects and groups and so forth. This is just a Japanese scholar engaged at Harvard University. And so, yeah, we have some cultural bias in the language, but the insights are very familiar. The story is very familiar. In the scope of the modern era, even though it was some 800 years ago, a little less than that, Nichiren's life still rather fresh, well documented. We've got over 500 videos on the writings of Nichiren from different sources, yeah. But this is providing us some insight. So far in this account, we've seen how Nichiren's circumstances of his life brought him into cognizance of the larger politic and social reality of Japan rather than just his regional upbringing, right? As a fisherman's son. He traveled. He was educated by other scholars in Buddhism. And originally very familiar with Amida Buddhism. That was probably the most popular form, not probably, but documented most popular form of Buddhist practice in Japan at the time. That's the chanting of Amida Buddha, which really is a religion. Buddhism is about living this life well. And Amida Buddhism is more like any other religion where, well, we just need to suffer through this life, and after we die, we can go to the nice place. That's religious, magical, mystical thinking. It's like believing in Santa Claus. Whatever you can derive from that, to live by that, a subject of great debate, right? But that's not Buddhism. Buddhism has always been about living this life unencumbered by stress and anxiety, right? Which is identified in Buddhism as our attachment and nature of collecting and owning. And from that position, we create this massive tower of ego, self. And that's why we're constantly nurturing and trying to hold up that straw man or straw woman. So it doesn't take very long for Nichiren in his studies to think something's gone awry here. And we follow his journey all the way up to the center of research and scholarship in Buddhism in Mount Ye, where there's several schools, and he discovers Dengyo, Saicho, and he discovers the Tendai tradition, going all the way back to Chi-I, or Chi-Che, or so many ways he's translated his name. We know him as Tendai because he's named after the mountain Tendai. But, so Nichiren studies. He studies and he studies and he learns more and more. And not only does he study Shakyamuni's sermons as they are translated, but he goes to China for in the form of the libraries from Dengyo's research and others. because many of those scholars went back and forth between Japan and China, yeah, and Korea. And he also does research on those cultures, and he learns about, as he's reading the sutra, there's these references to Taoism and Confucian and other, should we call them folklore? They're ingrained in the Chinese culture, yeah? So he learns about Chinese history and Japanese history and Korean history. He really fills himself with this. He's got this drive to know that there's something true here that's not being echoed in the popular religious practices of our day. And more he becomes convinced that I know I'm seeing something correct here that's not happening, that needs to be made clear. Because at some point he becomes almost insulted at the ruse that these politicians who say they're Buddhists but are really leading people like cattle by the nose down this subservient, well, it's easier to control them when they all feel like they're powerless. They can't do anything about their lives, certainly not personally. It's handy. Religion is a really great way of controlling a large populace. Fill them with fear, fill them with anxiety. And Nichiren's getting angrier and angrier. This is not just an injustice. This is foul. This is, in the words of the translations, evil. So he takes this personally. And then he gets smacked for it. They try to kill him. They send him off out of the country to some remote island or peninsula in this case. Just die. Just go away. It gives him, Nichiren, quite some time to reflect. And he comes back a little mollified, but no less convinced that he's right, because now he's starting to see in the Lotus Sutra, singularly, his life story. He relates so much with the story of the Lotus Sutra. He's like, yeah, the more you pronounce the truth, the more they assail you. But the more I shall be militant and not be moved, because I know the right way to do this. But after being exiled and coming back and still, being Nichiren, he feels all the more compassion for those students who look to him for advice. And he starts to develop this double-sidedness about himself. Not, a schism or anything, but just that a deep, abiding, heartfelt compassion for his students who he doesn't want to see, which they were, attacked by the samurai, the agents of the government, for just listening to him. He wants them to learn and see the Buddhism as he sees it, and they certainly respect that, want that. But at the same time, he doesn't want them to be chased out of the country. He doesn't want them to have their lands taken away from them or their families broken apart or, so on and so forth. And he starts to understand the depth, the fallout, if you will, or the wake of his determinism. He has to maintain his determinism to change the nature of the way the government and the authorities and the elite are oppressing Japan. And at the same time, he has to nurture and protect those who would hold him up as a leader and the progenitor of change, yeah? Not an easy situation to be in. Kind of like a parent trying to raise a teenager. You have on the one hand a young adult who's trying to figure out who the hell they are and how the world works in their minds, and somebody with much greater length of experience and fallen down and gotten up and has a much broader worldview, the parent, and how the two can coexist. It's legend how difficult that is, yeah? Once that teenager grows up, of course, they either feel a guilt or a great debt of gratitude to their parents, most of the time, in some form. Others just have to break away, not just leave home, but leave their parents to their own devices. This is also why, no different in Nichiren's day, there's such a focus on filial responsibility, right? We read that a lot in Nichiren, and that's part of his tender side. So now we're in a transition phase for Nichiren's life. He understands that he can't back down, that he has been driven by a truth which he, more and more with every passing year, not only sees it more vividly for himself, but also more vividly in terms of the repercussions which are discussed in the very teaching that he's desiring wholeheartedly to uphold. So there's a lot of self-justification there for his actions, his practice, his determinism, but at the same time, he's less and less seeing himself as just an individual, but more and more a representation of something worldly, universally, more and more important, but more and more inclusive of those he would teach. And so Nichiren grows from an individual who's determined to an individual who's an personage, an embodiment of a change that's far bigger than just Rensho, right? Bigger than himself. And so his compassion grows and his teaching grows in these two paths. One trying to change the direction of the nation, and the other trying to uphold and support and protect as a parent. So you have a sovereign parent, right, to the other practitioners. And this is where we're at in his life so far. So let's just jump in and follow our author here as he follows Nichiren's life timeline. Another instance of tenderness is shown in a letter written to a lady who is asked about the rules to be observed during her monthly period. And you think, gross. Why has he got to talk to a woman about that? Well, and this is still true today in many areas of the world. So consider, ladies, this was regarded by Japanese custom as a pollution. Right? It's still a very misogynistic culture to this day, Japan is. But certainly in medieval times, menstruation, it was easy for men to take a higher ground and say, oh, look at that disgusting creature bleeding. The most amazing thing, a woman's reproductive system, which should have been seen as this amazing, lauded woman going through this process. My gosh, ladies, men have no way to comprehend that amazing ability that you have. And when people are confused, men and women, but when people are confused, when they don't understand something, what is the tendency of a samsaric human being? When they can't wrap their heads around something, they vilify it. They turn it into evil. They make up stories about it to denigrate it. Well, to this day, menstruation is looked at that way. Much more mildly, of course, but still there. I think it should be celebrated. Man, look at that. That engine of life, of transmigration from energy to matter, to mass. Think of it like that. Men can't do that. Men can only work on and manipulate what is already there. But ladies, women, you can make life. That's super intimidating to males, right? Unless they participate and understand that it's part of our being as well. No one can escape coming through there. That's an amazing facility you have, ladies. But in Japan, in the medieval times, you're polluting the planet. What? It's so nonsensical, but... And women in this state were forbidden to approach Shinto sanctuaries. Oh yeah, you can't come to our holy places. You'll sully with your smell and your, right? You don't come to our places of worship, not realizing that they're the ones polluting Buddhism and the populace, but never mind that. It's amazing to me. Her question, therefore, was, what should she do about the Lotus teachings during that time? Should I hide myself? Should I put away the books so they can't know my period, my menstruation? Is that an offense to Shakyamuni Buddha in the Lotus Sutra? Poor woman. And Nichiren undoubtedly felt this. How do I'm not a woman, I don't know, but I can speak in terms of Shakyamuni's teachings and the Lotus Sutra. There's no room for that stupidity in the culminating teachings of Buddhism. So Nichiren deems it unnecessary to observe any precaution in that respect. This is his natural thing. Don't feel guilty about it. Don't feel you have to be any different. Buddhism is Buddhism. It's your mind. It's your Buddha-ness. Should it not include menstruation? The formation of stars and planets? He admonishes her to recite the sutra every day. If you have any ill ease about your menstruation and how you're polluting the planet, Japan, or spirituality, get it out of your mind. In fact, double down. Recite the Lotus Sutra every day. Right? We read that Gosho. Yet he adds that if because of the habit and custom she has scruples about doing so, see, there's that sensitivity. You were raised into this. This is a cultural reality. If I tell you to do totally the opposite, you might question not me, Nichiren, but Buddhism. It might shock you that you shouldn't feel bad about it. So if you still have, by your own cultural necessities, a reason to observe your menstruation as something of import, I'm telling you, go ahead and keep chanting. But she needs to hold the roles of the scriptures. It will suffice to pronounce the sacred title. So if you're concerned about opening the Lotus Sutra and doing Gangyo, as we do, and somehow exposing Gangyo to your sullied state, if you're still unsure, you can simply just chant Namo Myo Renge Kyo. that will suffice. Because when you chant, right, we've read it many times in Nichiren and in other sutras, simply invoking the title invokes all of the teachings within that sermon, that teaching. Delicate consideration and counsel of this kind are by no means rare in Nichiren's instructions, but they become more frequent after his return from exile. In general, we see how exile and residence among the simple country folk had tempered Nichiren's spirit with regard to students and followers. Right? He was seeing himself develop as less of a military leader, like, do what I do at the cost of your life, and more, this is my mission to do what I do at the cost of my life. That doesn't mean you can't follow in my footsteps, but you don't have to be wielding a sword or being military about it. Just inculcate these ideas in your mind. You don't have to follow me into battle. Right? Making him more gracious and sympathetic. So a few people felt like they got closer to their great teacher by virtue of his compassion. His close contact with the people of Izu, especially the fisherman and his wife who sheltered him there, led him to give his instruction a more popular form and to take a deeper personal interest in his followers. So now in autumn of the following year, in 1264, while Nichiren was thus carrying on his propaganda, his proselytizing, boy, I can't say that word this morning, as he was teaching his students and on his journeys, right, around Kamakura and elsewhere. Both polemic and persuasive, the illness of his mother called him to his native home or place. So as I was saying earlier, he was still very polemic, very angry at the leaders and the influences and the politic and the propaganda that was really throwing Buddhism in the gutter and instantiating a clear teaching of Shakyamuni's and the way things should be practiced for the enlightenment of the individual and therefore, in its multiplicity, the nation. While always railing against those huge forces of elite government backed by samurai. But his mother got sick, and his dad had already passed away. So this was his final parent, right? So he had to run to see her life condition. When he arrived at home, his mother was seemingly dead. She was not in good shape. The pious son, I don't know if I'd call him pious, but certainly we can use that word in the West, but we understand his conviction, his knowing of truth in the Lotus Sutra was unshakable. And when he saw his mother, however, not disheartened in his resolve, but went on to meditate with her that her life might be restored. He took the energies of his life and he physically embodied sharing that energy, the vitality of his practice of Buddhism in close proximity and in compassion for his mother, that she should recover. I mean, pretty bold. He didn't just go to her to want her to have an easy death. He kind of selfishly wanted her to stick around, if for no other reason than to practice Buddhism correctly, that she could for herself attain some awakening, if not complete perfect awakening, before her time to die. And you'll see that this is the form of discussion in the sutras, not just Nichiren, in the view of good and evil, not a Western good and evil. It's Western rhetoric. But good and evil are measured in Buddhism as promulgating our ability to attain enlightenment or standing in the way of it. That's the only good and evil in Buddhism, right? So his efforts were rewarded. He says here, prayer were heard. Heard by who? See, that's that damn Western rhetoric of religion trying to penetrate in here. It doesn't belong. His prayer was heard. See that magical thinking? Doesn't it stand out like a sore thumb when you read it? You bozo. His prayer wasn't heard. His deep, profound commitment, his life energy, affected, influenced his mother. How much more amazing is that? That's real. Or his supernormal power provided or proved efficacious, and gradually the aged mother recovered her health. Oh, wow. Thanks for the concession there, dude. Anasaki. Not only was his mother's restored health a great joy to Nichiren, but the demonstration of these miraculous powers that we have inherent in our lives that we don't use or we're ignorant of. We're all made this way. We are huge amalgams of energy. And that energy, if you've ever practiced any kind of martial art, we talk about it freely. Whether you call it ki or chi or bioelectric energy of the body, we know it exists, but we don't think in those terms. We actually should. We should be very cognizant of the fact that we're big radiating lights moving around in the universe. And when we enter a room, the room feels our energy, just like a light bulb. It radiates through us. That's how we influence others. We actually affect their fields of energy, like magnets. This is a fact, folks. This isn't magic. It's how the very fabric of the universe works. The same reason the moon goes around the earth and the earth goes around the sun and the sun is moving through a spiral arm of the galaxy and on and on and on. Everything works in this way. And he saw with his fervent Namo Myo Renge Kyo, his instantiation of his most focused energies, he affected his mother's health. Not just an ego proof, because it wasn't an ego he was building. It was a deep, profound understanding of the power of Buddhism, of the power of recognizing that energy and letting it flow unimpeded. How amazing and powerful a way of being that is, that Shakyamuni had discovered and laid directions on how to accomplish. It just solidified his resolve, didn't it? But the demonstration of this led him at once to take a step toward the fulfillment of a very high desire long since cherished by him, the conversation of his old master Dozen, the abbot of Kiyozumi, who still remained a believer in the Amita and practiced Shingon mysteries. Yeah, his old teacher now came to his mind and thought, he saw proof, he thought, man, if the correct understanding of Buddhism, the validation of the merits of human life can be actualized in such a powerful way, I think back to the first teacher that I have that set me on this path. I must be able to convince him. Remember, he had an opportunity some 10, 11 years before to share his discoveries with his fellow students and teachers, and they all pushed him out. They ran him out. And now he's thinking, well, now I can demonstrate. I certainly can demonstrate. I have such an example and a different life condition. I have to be able to reach my teacher just as a repayment of gratitude for him setting me on the path. Surely I owe him this. The three objects of reverence and gratitude in Nichiren's ethics, as we shall see later, were a man's parents, the ruler, and the master. The master being somebody who practices correctly, unassailably, and teaches others, right? Nichiren's parents had long since been converted to his resolve. The father had died 6 years before, but his efforts to convert the rulers were still unsuccessful, and his old master had never been subject to his influence. From the day of the first sermon in the assembly hall of Kiyozumi 11 years before, as I just stated, Nichiren now visited the abbot at a monastery in the country, explained his own conviction, expressed his highest desire for his master's conversion, exposed the old man's error, tenderly persuaded him to enter on the true way. A compassionate plea to this now elder master to see the Lotus Sutra for what it is rather than what it's been distorted into by others. But alas, the man was now too old and weak to abandon the religious practices to which he'd long been accustomed and become his former pupil's convert. He appreciated Nichiren's kindly intention. I see what you're saying. It's laudable. I appreciate you. Kind words from an ex-master. Thanked him for his zeal and wept with conflicting emotions. I know you're right. I know you're right, but I feel I'm too old to change my ways. Gosh! How frustrating, yeah? But the meeting was, after all, a failure. This remained a great regret to Nichiren throughout his life. After the old man's death, Nichiren in 1276 still tried to mitigate this sorrow by dedicating to the dead master a writing of spiritual admonition. We read that in the Gosho, yeah. This visit to his native place was an interlude in the perilous life of Nichiren. Affectionate reminiscences of his childhood were associated with a high overriding desire to perpetuate these early relationships into his future. But the interlude was destined to be interrupted. Whenever Nichiren, the apostle of truth, went, the shadow of danger attended him. There were always those who were, whether they were government agents or not, there were people in the populace who blindly followed the samurai leadership, the shogunate, the religious, pious, the nembutsu, the zen, the whatever. And so they took on the political mantle of their group, and all of them saw Nichiren as a great thorn in their side. So, mobs would gather, not sanctioned by any government body or anything, just a bunch of local yokels who thought, we'll earn a badge for our group if we get rid of this annoyance. Maybe we'll get some money. Yeah. I mean, if you got to worry about the government authorities coming and taking your land or taking your children or your wife. On the one hand, if you do something that you know the government or your elite group wants, then maybe you get royalties from that. You get privileges, right? People are motivated by their greed all the time, and we live in that age. Greed, manipulation, stupidity, welcome. The shadow was now embodied in the person of the local chief, the local mayor, who had tried to kill him immediately after the assembly at Kiyozumi. Kiyozumi. Remember, we spoke on that. When Nichiren parted from the abbot and left the village monastery where they had met, his adversary was waiting for him. Oh, Nichiren's going and talking to his old master, huh? Well, let's let him have his little chat, and we'll be ready for him when he comes out, that son of a... Yeah? It was early in the evening on an autumn day that Nichiren, accompanied by a few of his disciples, followers, from among the monks and some believing warriors, so he had some samurai who were converted to his teaching, his doctrine. They were making their way through the gloom of the pine forest, and the pursuer, with hundreds of his troops, cut off the way. Ha ha ha. Hello, Nichiren. The danger was imminent. Quote, shooting arrows flew like raindrops, Nichiren narrates. Shooting arrows flew like raindrops, and the sparks from the clashing swords were like lightning. One of my disciples was instantly killed. 2 others severely wounded, and I myself received a blow on the forehead. There seemed to be no hope of escape, but I was saved. Saved not in a spiritual sense, but saved in a physical sense. How? I cannot explain. How did I survive that attack? Thus, my gratitude toward the Lotus of Truth has never since grown deeper. He immediately associated his survival of that attack with his devout, resolute convictions of Shakyamuni's teachings. That energy in itself was the only thing that could have been responsible for making sure he didn't die in that moment. Even though he had to experience it, he survived. The wound on his forehead, and this is Nichiren's own translation of his own words. When we read that in a Go show, I don't remember what it was called, but the wound on his forehead was left to remind him of his narrow escape. So it scarred him, right? He had a scar. The orphan boy of the warrior disciple who had died in his defense became Nichiren's favorite disciple and served the prophet with an inherited devotion. Having gone through that, his father killed, protecting Nichiren, the son took up a deeper sense of devotion to Nichiren as his teacher. Although the attack seems to have been prompted by diverse motives, Nichiren saw in it a plot organized by the Amida Buddhists. So even though it was the mayor or the chief of the town that organized this mob to attack Nichiren, to try to kill him, obviously, Nichiren saw that the motivations of the attackers and the town chief, the area chief, the mayor, were motivated by their incessant practice of Amida Buddhism, Nembutsu. So again, Nichiren says everything in his life as a function of what Buddhism teaches, the way life works. Why wouldn't he? Just like today, we talk about weather changes and great fires and so forth as an obvious end result, or a result anyway, of prior conditions. Buddhism is no different. It's logical, yeah? Although the attack seems to have been prompted by diverse motives, Nichiren saw in it a plot organized by the Amida Buddhists. it had the effect of confirming his own conviction of the falsity of Amida Buddhism and the truth of his own understanding of Shakyamuni's teachings of the Lotus Sutra. And what was far more important was of strengthening his resolve, the resolve of Nichiren and his followers, that he was a man sent and protected by the Lord Shakyamuni and his truth. Not sent so much as his advent was documented by Shakyamuni thousands of years earlier. Someone like Nichiren had to come about to uphold the truth and spread these teachings of the Lotus Sutra, lest it be forgotten. And we just be a bunch of angry hordes, which hard not to see in today's world, but it doesn't have to be. The belief in his mission now, which had been growing since his days in Izu, reached a stage in which the self-consciousness of the prophet is more explicitly proclaimed. After having told of the incident in a letter above cited and quoting the same passages of the teachings he cited in his writings in Izu, Nichiren tells more of himself. And this is a quote from one of his writings, and we'll end on this. There are many in Japan who read and study the Lotus of Truth, the Lotus Sutra, the Myoho Renge-kyo. There are again many who are attacked because they have conspired against others, but there is none who is abused because of his revering the Lotus of Truth. Thus, none of the men in Japan who hold to the scripture, the teaching, the Lotus, have yet realized what is stated in the Lotus, since everyone who really holds it to it must encounter perils on that account. The one who really reads it is none other than I, Nichiren, who put in practice the text, quote, "We shall not care for bodily life, but do our best for the sake of the incomparable way," end quote. Then I, Nichiren, am the one, supreme one, the pioneer of the Lotus of Truth. So, we've read it in that's obviously, that translation's a little different than what we've read in the past. But suffice it to say that after everything that's gone on since his return from Izu, it becomes more and more blindingly obvious that Nichiren, in a way, doesn't own his own life anymore. He's not just a fisherman's son. He's not just a guy who believes in a different scholarship of Buddhism. He, in fact, is the personification of the mission Shakyamuni foretold, that in this day, this modern era, there had to be someone to step up. Because in this age, there were going to be a lot of defiled, degenerate views that were going to bury the truth of the Lotus Sutra, the truth of Buddhism, for political power means, but whatever. And it was happening. In Nichiren's day, it was happening. Buddhism was a joke. It was just another religion used to govern the people and scare them. And none of Nichiren's study validated that view. Everything he studied, the more he studied, the more clear it became. And so Nichiren was realizing that he embodied was evident and existing solely for a purpose, not to be Rencho, but to be that conveyor of truth of the Lotus teaching. He, and we hear it all the time in the Gosho, he viewed himself as just a simple man. He's just another man, just like, or woman, He didn't see him as, but you understand, just a regular human. But what he knew in his mind, that was what of supreme importance that needed to be sown into the minds of all other beings. Sorry, my mouth is dry. I'm having a hard time talking. So this is that, I said a split. It's not, it's understanding the very value of one's life isn't in being this flesh and body. It's in being the influence, the correct influence, right? That's the merit of one's life. How do we influence the world around us? How do we call this influence to make it maximal? This is what Nichiren is now grappling with in the severe moment of medieval Japan. And this is what we emulate. He's showing us what it is to truly embody this truth of the Lotus Sutra, the Myoho Renge Kyo. And we'll continue in the next video. In the meantime, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for participating in this great resource to do as Nichiren did, in our small way, influence others to their maximal experience of life. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Patrons supporting all of our efforts here through Patreon or PayPal or by donations. I've had some mailed to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's so important. And for all of those who just like and subscribe, that too is Bodhisattva. So thank you for your efforts. Keep your practice strong. Be kind to yourself. Take care of your health. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now. Myoho Renge Kyo.